He thought he was discarding a penniless burden in front of the city's elite, but he was actually handing a trillion-dollar confession to the most powerful man in America. As Sterling Vance dropped those divorce papers in a Breyer's lap and mocked her pregnancy, he didn't realize the security cameras were broadcasting his cruelty directly to a fleet of armored SUVs circling the building. Most people spend their lives trying to get to the top. Sterling spent his night ensuring he'd hit the bottom. If you aren't subscribed yet, you're missing the blueprints to survive the world's most dangerous traps. Don't be the one left wondering what went wrong. Stay until the end, because when Breyer's true father walks through those doors, the look on Sterling's face will redefine the meaning of total regret. The sound of a heavy slap didn't just echo in the ballroom. It shattered the 3-year lie Breyer had been living. Sterling Vance stood over his 8-month pregnant wife, his hands still red, his face twisted in a sneer that 50 of Houston's wealthiest families witnessed in haunting silence. "Sign it, Breyer," he hissed, throwing the ink pen at her feet. "You were a placeholder. The Thorne merger requires a wife with a real pedigree, not a charity case from the outskirts." As Breyer gripped her stomach, her eyes didn't fill with tears. They filled with a cold, calculated clarity. She looked at the blinking red light of the ceiling camera and whispered, "Are you watching, Dad?" 3 hours earlier, Breyer had walked into the Grand Meridian Ballroom wearing a simple cotton dress that hugged her pregnant belly, believing she was attending a baby shower her husband had planned. The invitation had been beautiful, cream cardstock with gold lettering that read, "Celebrating New Beginnings." She thought it meant their daughter. She was wrong. Sterling stood at the center of the room beneath crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes, his arm wrapped around a woman Breyer had never seen before. Her name was Celine, and she wore diamonds that caught the light like warnings Breyer should have seen months ago. The guests weren't cooing over baby gifts. They were toasting a merger. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling announced, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the room. "Tonight marks the beginning of a new chapter for Vance Global. A partnership that will secure our legacy for generations." He raised his glass toward Celine, and the room erupted in polite applause. Breyer stood frozen near the entrance, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. That's when Helena Vance, Sterling's mother, spotted her. The older woman's face twisted with disgust as she crossed the marble floor, her heels clicking like a countdown. "What are you doing here?" Helena hissed, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "This is a business event, not a charity function for whatever gutter Sterling pulled you from." Breyer's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Sterling told me this was for the baby." He said, "The baby?" Helena laughed, sharp and cruel. "You think a child changes anything? You were a breeding experiment, dear. Nothing more. My son needs a wife who brings value, not bills." The room had gone quiet now, all eyes fixed on the pregnant woman in the simple dress and the socialite dripping in inherited wealth. Sterling walked over, and for a moment, Breyer thought he might defend her. Instead, he pulled a thick envelope from his jacket and dropped it into her trembling hands. "Sign the papers, Breyer. This marriage was a mistake I'm correcting tonight." The slap came when she tried to speak. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of that ballroom, it sounded like a gunshot. Breyer stumbled backward, her hand flying to her burning cheek, her other arm wrapped protectively around her stomach. 50 witnesses. 50 people who did nothing. "You were worthless when I found you," Sterling said, his voice cold and final. "And you're worthless now." He grabbed her arm, not gently. and dragged her toward the service exit. Helena followed, shouting about embarrassment and reputation, her words dissolving into white noise as the metal door swung open to reveal a torrential downpour. Briar was shoved into the rain. The door slammed shut behind her. She stood there, soaked in seconds, staring at the closed entrance of the building where her marriage had just been executed in front of Houston's elite. But then she heard it, the low hum of engines. 5 black SUVs pulled into the circular drive, their headlights cutting through the storm like judgment arriving on schedule. The lead vehicle's door opened, and a man stepped out. Alistair Thorne didn't rush. He didn't need to. His presence made the rain feel irrelevant, the storm secondary. He walked toward his daughter with the calm of someone who had already decided how this night would end. When he reached Briar, he didn't ask if she was okay. He simply looked at the red mark on her face, and his expression shifted into something far more dangerous than anger. Quiet fury. Alistair Thorne wrapped his coat around Briar's shaking shoulders and guided her into the warm interior of the SUV without saying a word. The convoy didn't leave immediately. Instead, Alistair sat beside his daughter, studying the mark on her cheek with the focus of a surgeon examining a fatal wound. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and absolutely terrifying. 3 years, he said. I gave you 3 years to test him, to see if he could love you without knowing who you really are. He paused, his hand gently tilting Briar's face toward the light so he could see the full damage. He failed. Briar's voice cracked. I wanted to believe people could be good without a reason, Dad. I wanted him to love me, not your money. Alistair's expression softened for only a moment before hardening into stone. And now he's shown you exactly who he is. A man who strikes a pregnant woman doesn't deserve mercy. He deserves a lesson. He pulled out his phone, and with 2 taps, he initiated what his security team called the Erasure Protocol. Inside the ballroom, Sterling was laughing with Celine, completely unaware that his world was being dismantled in real time. His phone buzzed, then Helena's, then every board member's in the room. The first notification came from Sterling's bank. Your American Express black card has been suspended due to irregular activity. He frowned, assuming it was a mistake. The second notification came 30 seconds later. Your credit line with Vance Global has been closed. Outstanding balance due immediately. Sterling's face went pale. He tried calling his bank. The line was busy. He tried his accountant. No answer. He tried his lawyer, who picked up on the first ring and said 5 words that made Sterling's knees weak. Mr. Thorne just bought your debt. Back in the SUV, Briar stared at her father. You bought their debt. Alistair's smile was cold. I bought everything, sweetheart. The mortgages, the business loans, the country club memberships, even the lease on Helena's Mercedes. He handed Briar a folder. Inside were deeds, contracts, and financial records she'd never seen before. These are the summer estates in Colorado that Sterling's grandfather built. I've owned them for 2 decades. I'll let the Van Cess live there because I was waiting to see if your husband would prove himself worthy of my daughter. Briar's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. He has no idea. He will. Alistair leaned back, his expression unreadable. But I'm not the one who's going to tell him. You are. He handed her another folder, this one thicker. Tonight, we don't just take their money. We take their name. Inside the ballroom, Sterling was at the bar, trying to buy $1 million engagement ring for Celine to seal their merger. He handed over his black card with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. The jeweler swiped it once. Declined. Swiped it again. Declined. Sterling's face flushed red. There must be a mistake. The jeweler handed the card back. "I'm sorry, sir. This account has been closed." Celine's smile faltered. Helena rushed over, her own card in hand, insisting she'd cover it. Declined. Also closed. The room was starting to notice. Whispers spread like wildfire. Sterling pulled Celine aside, his voice frantic. "It's a technical issue. I'll have it fixed by morning." But morning would bring something far worse than declined credit cards. It would bring Breyer. Sterling woke up to a nightmare disguised as a news alert. Vance Global construction sites shut down amid safety violations. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through message after message from panicked employees, furious investors, and confused clients. Every active project across Texas had been red tagged by inspectors overnight. Coincidence? Impossible. He called an emergency board meeting, demanding answers. His directors filed into the glass-walled conference room at Vance Global headquarters, their faces grim. Sterling took his seat at the head of the table, trying to project authority he no longer felt. "Someone is targeting us. I want to know who and why." The door opened, but it wasn't his legal team. It was Breyer. She walked in wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Sterling's car, her hair pulled back, her posture radiating the kind of authority that couldn't be faked. Behind her stood two men in dark suits, not bodyguards, but lawyers. The kind that bill by the minute and won cases that shouldn't be winnable. Sterling's mouth fell open. "What are you doing here?" Breyer didn't answer him. She turned to the board. "Good morning, gentlemen. For those who don't know me, I'm Breyer Thorne. As of 6 a.m. this morning, I am the majority shareholder of Vance Global." She placed a leather portfolio on the table and slid it toward the company's lead attorney. "You'll find all the documentation inside. Verified, legal, irreversible." The attorney opened the folder, his face going white as he scanned the pages. He looked up at Sterling, then back at Breyer. This is legitimate." Sterling shot to his feet. "That's impossible. You're nobody. You have nothing." Breyer's smile was ice. "I had you convinced of that, didn't I?" She walked slowly around the table, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Every board member in this room now reports to me. Every contract you signed, every deal you made, every decision you thought was yours, it all required my approval. You just didn't know it." One of the directors cleared his throat. "Ms. Thorne, with all due respect, how did you acquire this level of control without us knowing?" "Because my father owns the investment group that saved this company from bankruptcy 5 years ago. You thought you were dealing with a silent partner. You were dealing with Alistair Thorne, and he was watching everything." She stopped in front of Sterling. "Including how you treated his daughter." Sterling's face twisted in disbelief and rage. "This is insane. You can't just—" "I already did." Breyer nodded to one of her lawyers, who pressed a button on a remote. The massive screen on the wall flickered to life, showing crystal-clear footage from the gala. The slap. The insults. Helena dragging Breyer into the rain. Celine laughing. 50 witnesses doing nothing. The room fell silent. One of the older board members turned to Sterling, disgust written across his face. "You struck a pregnant woman." Breyer let the video play for another 10 seconds before pausing it. "That's not all. Celine, the woman Sterling was planning to marry, has been working for a rival firm for the past 8 months. She's already sold your trade secrets, your client lists, and your proprietary designs." She slid another document across the table. "This is a signed confession. She's currently on a plane to Singapore, unreachable and untouchable." Sterling collapsed into his chair. "My mother, she has shares. Your mother signed them over 3 weeks ago to cover a gambling debt she accumulated at an offshore casino. Breyer's voice was clinical, detached. "I own those too." The room was suffocating. Sterling looked around the table, searching for allies, but every face had turned away from him. Breyer walked to the head of the table and stood where Sterling used to sit. She looked down at the man who'd called her worthless and smiled. "Let's discuss your severance package, Sterling. If you're still not subscribing, you're essentially voting for the bullies. Drop a comment. What's holding you back from joining the right side?" Breyer left the boardroom and never looked back. She had no interest in watching Sterling grovel or beg. Revenge wasn't about seeing him broken. It was about ensuring he could never break anyone else again. She returned to the Thorne estate, a sprawling property hidden behind gates that required 3 levels of clearance to pass. This was where she would prepare for the arrival of her daughter, far from the chaos she'd left behind. Inside the mansion, Alistair was waiting. He handed her a cup of tea and gestured toward the wall of windows overlooking the estate's private lake. "The Van Cess have been evicted from their Houston mansion," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. "Turns out I've owned that land for 40 years. I let them build on it as a courtesy to Sterling's grandfather, a man who actually had integrity." Breyer sipped her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. "And Helena?" Alistair's expression darkened. "She's been seen at a pawn shop on the east side, trying to sell jewelry I gifted the family years ago. The shop owner called me personally. I told him to give her fair market value, about 10% of what she thought it was worth." Breyer set down her cup and placed a hand on her belly, feeling her daughter kick. "I don't want her to suffer, Dad. I just want her to understand what it feels like to be powerless. She will." Alistair sat beside his daughter, his voice softening. "You spent 3 years playing a role, Breyer. You hid your name, your wealth, your legacy because you wanted to be loved for who you are, not what you own. That's nobility. But now it's time to reclaim what's yours." He pulled out another folder, this one labeled Hope's Trust Fund. Inside were documents showing a financial account worth hundreds of millions, legally tied to Breyer's signature alone. Sterling believed this baby would be his ticket back to wealth. He planned to use her as leverage. He doesn't know that every dollar in this fund requires your approval. He has no access, no claim, no power. Breyer stared at the documents, her mind racing. What if he tries to fight for custody? Alistair's laugh was humorless. He can try, but family court tends to frown on men who strike pregnant women on camera. He closed the folder. "Focus on your health, sweetheart. Let me handle the rest." But Sterling wasn't done trying. That night, security cameras caught him attempting to scale the estate's outer wall, his desperation overriding his common sense. He made it 3 feet before motion sensors triggered a blinding floodlight and an alarm that could wake the dead. Private security detained him within seconds, zip-tying his wrists while he screamed about his rights as a father. Breyer watched the footage from her bedroom, her hand resting on her belly. She felt no satisfaction, only pity for the man who'd chosen greed over love and was now paying a price he'd never calculated. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Vance Global embroiled in fraud scandal. Founder's family under investigation. The final domino had fallen. Alistair had leaked documents showing years of financial mismanagement, most of it tied to Helena's gambling addiction and Sterling's reckless spending. The Vance name, once synonymous with prestige, was now a cautionary tale. Breyer's water broke 3 hours later. As she was rushed to the hospital across town, Sterling's world collapsed in a holding cell where he'd been detained for trespassing. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The Thorne family's private medical wing was nothing like a typical hospital. It was quiet, sterile, and equipped with technology most facilities couldn't afford. Briar lay in a bed surrounded by the best doctors money could hire, her father holding her hand as contractions tore through her body. She'd never felt pain like this. Physical, yes, but also emotional. She was about to bring a child into a world where her father didn't want to know her. Across the city, Sterling sat in a cold jail cell, his expensive clothes wrinkled and dirty, his hands shaking as he stared at the concrete walls. The charges were minor: trespassing, resisting arrest, but the bail had been set impossibly high. Not because the crime was severe, but because Alistair Thorne had made a single phone call to a judge who owed him a favor. Sterling's lawyer had explained it in terms even a desperate man could understand. You're not getting out until Mr. Thorne says you can. The irony was suffocating. While Briar labored to bring his daughter into the world, Sterling couldn't even afford to post bail. Celine was gone, her phone disconnected, her social media accounts deleted. She'd vanished the moment the money disappeared, proving what Briar had known all along. Some people only love what you can give them, not who you are. At 3:47 a.m., Hope Thorne entered the world. She didn't cry immediately. For a terrifying moment, the room held its breath. Then a wail, strong, defiant, alive. Briar collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as the doctors placed her daughter on her chest. The baby was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a head full of dark hair and eyes that would one day hold the same fire as her grandfather's. Alistair Thorne, a man who'd negotiated with presidents and brought corporations to their knees, broke down completely. He stood beside the bed, his hand gently touching his granddaughter's tiny fingers, and wept. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "just like her mother." A nurse handed Briar a clipboard. "We need to complete the birth certificate." Father's name. Briar looked at her daughter, then at her own father, then back at the form. She picked up the pen and wrote in careful, deliberate letters, "Unknown." The nurse hesitated. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Briar's voice was steady. "This child will never know the man who raised his hand to her mother." In his cell, Sterling's phone, confiscated but checked periodically by guards, received a single photo message from an unknown number. It was a picture of a newborn baby, her eyes closed, her face peaceful. No name, no explanation, just proof that he'd lost everything that mattered while chasing things that didn't. The divorce papers arrived at the jail 2 hours later. A guard slid them through the slot in Sterling's cell door with the indifference of someone delivering junk mail. Sterling read them in the dim light, his hands trembling. The terms were simple. He would receive nothing. No assets, no custody, no contact. In exchange, Briar would ensure he avoided jail time for the fraud charges that were building against him. Fraud committed primarily by his mother, but fraud he'd knowingly ignored. He signed. What choice did he have? When the guard collected the papers, Sterling asked a question he already knew the answer to. "Is there any way I can see my daughter?" The guard didn't even look up. "No." Back at the hospital, Briar held Hope against her chest, feeling the rise and fall of her tiny lungs, the warmth of her skin, the weight of a future that no longer included the man who should have been standing beside her. She looked at her father and said 5 words that would define the rest of Hope's life. She will never know him. Only those who understand the value of character stay until the end. Subscribe now before the next twist catches you off guard. 5 years had passed since the night Sterling Vance slapped his pregnant wife in front of Houston's elite. 5 years since Briar Thorne disappeared into the rain and emerged as something far more powerful than the quiet woman he'd thrown away. The world had changed. Briar had changed. But Sterling? He'd simply fallen. Briar's morning began in a glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of Thorne Plaza, the building that used to bear the Vance name until Alistair erased it like chalk from a board. She sat at the head of a conference table, surrounded by executives twice her age, all of them hanging on her every word. She was 32 now, CEO of Thorne Media, and her reputation for turning failing companies into empires was legendary. But her greatest achievement wasn't in the boardroom. It was waiting for her at home. After the meeting, Briar drove to the estate where Hope was finishing breakfast with her grandfather. The little girl was 5 years old, sharp as a blade, with dark hair that fell in waves and eyes that held the same quiet fire Alistair had passed down through generations. Hope ran to her mother, wrapping small arms around Briar's legs. "Mommy, I built a robot that can sort colors." Briar knelt down, pulling her daughter close. "Show me everything." Across the country, in a basement apartment in Hartford, Connecticut, Sterling woke to the sound of water dripping from a leaking pipe. He'd moved here 3 years ago under an alias, Marcus Gray, working as a night shift clerk at a convenience store that smelled like stale coffee and regret. He'd fled Texas to escape creditors, old colleagues, and the constant reminders of everything he'd lost. But some ghosts followed, no matter how far you ran. He pulled on clothes that had seen better years and stepped into the gray morning. His route to work took him past a massive digital billboard that had been installed 6 months ago. It rotated through advertisements for luxury cars, high-end watches, and then her. Briar Thorne, standing in a tailored suit with Hope beside her, both of them smiling at the camera beneath the words, "Thorne Media, building tomorrow's legacy today." Sterling stopped walking. He stared at the child on that billboard. His daughter, though no legal document would ever confirm it, and saw his own features reflected back at him. Her nose, her chin, but her eyes? Those were pure Thorne. Fire and determination. She looked nothing like the broken man standing on a cracked sidewalk in Connecticut. A news report had aired the week before, profiling Briar's mysterious rise in the business world. The anchor called her a self-made billionaire, a woman who'd appeared out of nowhere and conquered industries overnight. They never mentioned Sterling. Not once. It was as if he'd never existed. As if 3 years of marriage and a daughter meant nothing. He continued walking, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. What he didn't know was that his mother, Helena, wasn't living in the luxury she'd once demanded. She was in a state-run care facility in Ohio, her mind slowly fading from early-onset dementia. The bills were being paid anonymously by a trust fund set up by Briar, not out of kindness, but out of a refusal to let cruelty define her. Helena would never know who saved her from dying on the streets. That afternoon, Sterling returned to his apartment to find an eviction notice taped to his door. His landlord had discovered a secret bank account Sterling thought he'd hidden well enough. An offshore account holding $23,000, the last remnant of his former life. The Thorne Group's lawyers had found it, frozen it, and seized it to cover debts Sterling didn't even remember accruing. He had 30 days to vacate. He crumpled the notice in his fist and looked around the tiny space that had been his prison for 3 years. One room, one window, one life that felt like someone else's nightmare. He pulled out his phone and searched for Briar's name, finding thousands of results. Articles, interviews, Forbes covers. She was everywhere. He was nowhere. Sterling stared at a photo of Hope on his cracked phone screen. A picture he'd pulled from a public news article about a charity event Breyer had hosted. The little girl was holding a trophy, her smile bright and confident. She didn't know him. She would never know him. And somewhere deep in the hollow space where his heart used to be, Sterling finally understood what he'd traded for ambition. Everything. Sterling spent 2 weeks planning something that would either save him or destroy the last shred of dignity he had left. He'd heard through industry gossip, the kind whispered in online forums by people who used to work for him, that Breyer was speaking at a tech summit in San Francisco, an event attended by world leaders, billionaires, and the kind of people who could change your life with a single phone call. Sterling convinced himself that if he could just talk to her face to face, he could appeal to some remaining piece of the woman who'd once loved him. He was wrong, but desperation has a way of making terrible ideas seem brilliant. He sold the last thing of value he owned, his grandfather's watch, a platinum heirloom that had survived 3 generations of ancestors. The pawn shop owner offered him $800. Sterling took it without negotiating. He used $600 for a bus ticket to California and spent the remaining $200 on a cheap suit from a thrift store that didn't quite fit. He looked like a man pretending to be someone he used to be. The summit was held at the Moscone Center, a sprawling venue filled with glass, steel, and people who belonged there. Sterling didn't. He approached the main entrance, his heart pounding, his palms sweating. The security guard at the gate barely looked up. "Credential? I don't have one, but I need to speak with Breyer Thorne. He hesitated, the lie catching in his throat. "I'm the father of her daughter." The guard's expression shifted from bored to amused. "Sure you are, buddy. And I'm the King of England. Move along. I'm serious. My name is Sterling Vance. Look it up. I used to." The guard held up a hand, already reaching for his radio. "Sir, if you don't leave the premises immediately, I'll have you removed." Sterling stepped back, his face burning with humiliation. He circled the building, trying different entrances, different guards, different lies. None of them worked. Through the glass walls, he could see Breyer on stage, a microphone in her hand, commanding a room of 2,000 people like she was born for it. She wore confidence the way other people wore jewelry. The audience hung on her every word. Sterling pressed his hand against the glass. Watching the woman he'd once called worthless inspire a room full of the world's most powerful people. The irony was suffocating. He'd spent 3 years trying to mold her into something she already was. He just hadn't been smart enough to see it. A security guard appeared beside him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave." Before Sterling could respond, the guard handed him an envelope. "You've been served." Sterling opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a cease and desist order, signed by Breyer's legal team, prohibiting him from attempting any contact with Breyer or Hope Thorne. Violation would result in immediate legal action, including restraining orders and potential criminal charges for harassment. The document was clinical, legal, and absolutely final. He stumbled away from the building, his vision blurring. The Vance name, once synonymous with power in Houston, was now a punchline. He'd overheard 2 conference attendees laughing about it over coffee. Remember Vance Global? That company that imploded because the CEO was too dumb to realize his wife owned everything? Classic. Sterling found a bench 3 blocks away and collapsed onto it. He pulled the cease and desist order from his pocket, reading it again as if the words might change. They didn't. But tucked behind the legal document was another piece of paper, a letter he didn't remember putting there. It was cream-colored cardstock, expensive, with a single line typed in elegant font. "Thorne Plaza, Boardroom 12, 9 a.m. tomorrow. Come alone. This is your final invitation." Sterling's hands trembled. He didn't know if this was mercy or execution, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had nothing left to lose. If you're still watching but haven't joined us, you're missing the blueprint for true power. Subscribe now, so you're never the one left in the hallway. Sterling arrived at Thorn Plaza 20 minutes early, his cheap suit wrinkled from sleeping on a bus station bench. The building that used to bear his family's name now towered above him like a monument to his failures. The lobby was all marble and glass, filled with people who moved with purpose and power. He approached the reception desk, his voice barely steady. "I have a meeting in boardroom 12. The receptionist didn't even look up. "Name?" "Marcus," he stopped himself. "Sterling Vance." Her fingers froze over the keyboard. She looked up, studying him with the kind of curiosity reserved for rare disasters. "Take the elevator to the 42nd floor. You'll be met." The elevator ride felt like descending into judgment. When the doors opened, a woman in a black suit stood waiting. She didn't introduce herself. She simply gestured toward a hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city Sterling used to believe he owned. At the end of the hall was a single door. Boardroom 12. Inside, Breyer sat alone at a table built for 20. She wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Sterling's rent for a year. Her expression was neutral, unreadable. She didn't stand when he entered. She didn't offer her hand. She simply gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." Sterling sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavier than any argument they'd ever had. Finally, Sterling broke. "I've changed, Breyer. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm trying to." She slid a folder across the table. "Open it." Inside were bank statements, transaction records, and screenshots of emails. Evidence that Sterling had been attempting to hide money in accounts under false names, moving funds through cryptocurrency, and even contacting old business associates to see if anyone would hire him under the table. His changed man, speech died in his throat. "You haven't changed," Breyer said, her voice calm and cold. "You've just gotten worse at lying." She pulled out another document. "I didn't just take your company, Sterling. I bought your debts. All of them. Every credit card, every loan, every penny you owe. It all belongs to me now. I am your sole creditor." Sterling's face went white. "Why?" "Because I wanted you to understand something." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "I didn't destroy you. I stopped protecting you from yourself." She opened another folder, this one containing photos of Celine, his former fiancée, meeting with Thorn Group executives months before she ever approached him. "Celine was never your salvation. She was a test. My father hired her to see if you could be loyal when tempted. You failed within 3 weeks." Sterling's world tilted. "You set me up?" "I gave you a choice," Breyer corrected. "You made it." She slid a final document across the table. "A contract. I'm offering you a deal. A lifetime stipend of $2,000 a month. Enough for rent, food, and basic expenses. In exchange, you sign a permanent no-contact order for Hope. You will never attempt to see her, speak to her, or acknowledge her existence. If you break this agreement, the money stops, and I will personally ensure every remaining door in your life slams shut." Sterling stared at the contract. $2,000 a month. It was barely survival, but it was more than he had. He looked at Breyer, searching for some trace of the woman who'd once loved him. She was gone. In her place sat someone who'd learned that mercy and justice weren't the same thing. "The pen," Breyer said, sliding one across the table. It was the same type he'd thrown at her feet 5 years ago. Sterling picked it up, his hand shaking. He thought about Hope, the daughter he'd never held, never fed, never read stories to. The child who would grow up believing her father was unknown. He thought about the life he could have had if he'd just loved the woman in front of him instead of the money behind her. He signed. Briar took the contract, placed it in her briefcase, and stood. You traded your daughter for groceries, Sterling. I hope you remember that every time you eat. She walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. Don't contact me again. This meeting never happened. The door closed. Sterling sat alone in the boardroom, staring at his empty hands, realizing he'd just sold the last piece of his soul for the price of survival. 6 months passed. Sterling lived in a single room above a laundromat in Philadelphia, the monthly stipend from Briar arriving like clockwork on the first of every month. He worked odd jobs, delivering newspapers, cleaning offices at night. Not because he needed the money, but because the silence of unemployment was unbearable. The work kept his hands busy. It couldn't keep his mind quiet. Helena Vance passed away on a Tuesday morning in November. The care facility called Sterling from a number he didn't recognize, informing him that his mother had died peacefully in her sleep. They mentioned she'd been well cared for, that all her needs had been met, that she'd spent her final years believing her son was still a successful businessman. They didn't tell him who'd been paying the bills. Sterling knew. He attended the funeral alone. No family, no friends, just a man standing over a casket, realizing his mother had died, believing a lie he'd been too ashamed to correct. The priest asked if he wanted to say anything. Sterling shook his head. What could he say? That he destroyed everything she built? That the Vance name was now synonymous with failure? That her granddaughter didn't even know she existed? That night, Sterling sat in his tiny room and searched for Hope's name online. He found a video from a school science fair held 2 weeks earlier. Hope stood on a stage, holding a trophy nearly as tall as she was, her smile bright and confident. The interviewer asked what inspired her project, a water filtration system designed for communities without clean drinking water. Hope's answer broke something in Sterling's chest. My mom always says that power isn't about what you take. It's about what you give. I wanted to give something that mattered. Sterling watched the video 17 times. He memorized the way Hope's eyes lit up when she talked about helping people. The way she stood with the same quiet confidence Briar had carried even when he'd tried to break her. The way she was everything he could have had a hand in creating, if only he'd been worthy of the chance. He pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. The letter took 3 hours. He rewrote it 4 times, each version stripping away excuses until all that remained was truth. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't beg for a second chance. He simply admitted what he'd spent 5 years refusing to accept. He hadn't lost money. He'd lost the only person who'd ever seen him as more than a transaction. The final version was simple, honest. Too late. Dear Briar, I am writing this from a place I probably deserve. Not because of the room I'm in, but because of the man I became. You loved me when I had nothing to offer but myself, and I repaid you with cruelty. I slapped you. I mocked you. I threw away the only real thing I'd ever been given. I didn't lose your father's money. I lost you, and that is a debt I will carry until the day I die. Tell Hope that her father was a fool who learned too late what mattered. I don't deserve her forgiveness. I just want her to know I'm sorry. Sterling. He mailed the letter to the Thorne estate, expecting it to be burned or shredded or thrown away unopened. What he didn't know was that Alistair Thorne intercepted it. The older man read it twice, then walked to his daughter's office and placed it on her desk without a word. Briar stared at the envelope for a long time. She didn't open it immediately. When she finally did, she read Sterling's words in silence, her expression never changing. When she finished, she walked to the fireplace in her study and held the letter over the flames. Her hand hovered there for 30 seconds. Then she lowered it, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in a safe labeled for Hope when she's 30. She locked the safe and whispered to the empty room, "Some truths need time to breathe." Most people won't subscribe because they think they're safe. They don't realize how fast the floor can drop. Subscribe to stay grounded. 5 years to the day after Sterling Vance had thrown Briar into the rain, she stood in the gardens of her estate in Virginia, watching Hope chase fireflies across the lawn. The little girl was 10 now, brilliant and kind, with a laugh that sounded like hope itself. Alistair sat beside Briar on a stone bench, his hair fully silver now, his hand resting gently on his daughter's shoulder. "Do you ever think about him?" Alistair asked quietly. Briar didn't have to ask who he met. Sometimes, not with anger, just curiosity. "I wonder if he ever figured out what he lost." Alistair nodded. He did. That letter proved it. But understanding your mistakes doesn't undo them. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Hope's joy fill the evening air. Then, as if the universe had a sense of irony, it began to rain. Not a storm, just a gentle, steady rain that turned the garden into something softer. Hope squealed and ran toward the house, but Briar stood instead. She walked out into the rain, her face turned toward the sky, her arms spread wide. Hope stopped running. "Mommy, you're getting wet." Briar smiled. "I know, sweetheart. Come here." Hope hesitated, then walked back into the rain. Briar took her daughter's hands, and together they spun in slow circles, laughing as the water soaked their clothes and hair. This rain wasn't punishment. It wasn't exile. It was freedom. It was reclaiming a memory and turning it into something beautiful. Alistair watched from the covered porch, his eyes wet with something that wasn't rain. He'd built an empire worth trillions, but watching his daughter teach his granddaughter that strength wasn't about staying dry. It was about dancing when you're soaked. That was his greatest legacy. Later that night, after Hope had gone to bed, Briar sat in her study reviewing documents for a merger. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. A small article, barely noticed. Former executive Sterling Vance found volunteering at Philadelphia homeless shelter. There was a photo. Sterling, older, thinner, serving food to people who looked the way he once had. The article mentioned nothing about his past. Just a man trying to give back. Briar read it twice, then closed her phone. She didn't feel vindicated. She didn't feel victorious. She felt something quieter. Peace. Sterling had found his own path to understanding. It wasn't her job to walk it with him. She looked at a framed photo on her desk. Hope's first day of school. Her backpack almost as big as she was, her smile fearless. Briar whispered to the image, "You'll never know the man who hurt your mother, but you'll always know the woman who chose to rise." Somewhere in Philadelphia, Sterling stood at a window, watching rain streak down the glass. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't desperate. He'd finally made peace with being nobody. And in that strange, quiet acceptance, he found something he'd never had when he was somebody. Honesty. The final shot would be Briar, standing in her office, looking directly at the camera with the kind of calm that only comes from surviving your own storm. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of a life rebuilt from ashes. Be careful who you step on today. They might be the one holding the world together tomorrow. If you've learned the value of a quiet soul, prove it. Subscribe and tell me in the comments. Would you have forgiven Sterling or let him stay in the gutter?
Hey there. Thank you so much for watching till the very end. We really appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And guess what? The story doesn't end here. Click on the video right here on your screen to dive into another fascinating story. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Once again, thanks for being a part of this amazing community. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring stories that move you.